good afternoon, or good evening, depending on where you're watching our seminar from. Thank you for being with us today. I am Caterina Marinetti, and I work as Scientific Project Manager for the NEWAVE Innovative Training Network. We are thrilled to be launching today the seminar series as part of the NEWAVE Diffused conference, which started last week and will be accompanying us until the end of the year with bi-weekly online webinars. These thematic seminars feature the NEWAVE early stage researchers that will guide us through the key water governance aspects that they have been investigating during the NEWAVE project. Today's seminar will last in total 1 hour and a half, started with Nina Valin's lecture on the European water law in the books and in action, with insights from a science policy perspective. Together with Nina Valin, we are honored to welcome Peter Gameltoft as invited discussant and Professor Dave Houtema as primary supervisors of Nina's PhD. I want to kindly remind you that you can submit your questions anytime during the seminar using the Q&A function on Zoom. I will now invite Dr. Gianpierre Dell'Angelo, Principal Investigator of NEWAVE, to introduce our speakers. Thank you so much and enjoy the seminar.
Thank you, Caterina. Hi, everyone. I'm Gianpierre Dell'Angelo. I'm really honored to be in your company and to be able to introduce our speakers. So starting from Nina Valin, she is a PhD student at the Department of Environmental Policy Analysis at the Institute for Environmental Studies of the Vrije Universiteit Amsterdam. And as a PhD student, she's part of the NEWAVE Marie Curie Innovative Training Network. And she's working on the interplay between experts and policymakers in policy change, taking specifically the Water Framework Directive as a case study. And together with Nina, we have the honor to introduce and have Peter Gameltoft joining us today. He's an expert in environment, water, and climate change, and has worked for many years at the European Commission, notably as the head of the water unit within the DG Environment. And during his time at the Commission, he led the drafting and adoption of the EU Water Framework Directive. So I cannot think of anyone better to bring in this type of conversation today. As the supervisor of Nina's PhD, we have Dave Houtema, lead of the synthesis work package of NEWAVE. He's a professor at Wageningen University and chair of the Public Administration Group, and a very renowned and well-known expert in different domains of policy and governance, from climate change to water. Without further ado, Nina, I would like to invite you to take the stage.
Thank you so much, Gianpierre, for this introduction. I will start sharing my screen. This. I hope you can see it well. All good? Super. So hi, everyone. Thank you so much for being here. Thank you again to Peter for being a discussant, and to Dave for commenting also after the presentation. So as Gianpierre mentioned, for the last 3.5 years, I've been looking at EU water law, and in particular at the case of the European Water Framework Directive. And I'm now at the late stages of my PhD, so writing of the manuscript. So it's also a very interesting stage with opportunities for feedback. So please, I would love to hear your questions also in the Q&A at the end. But today I will start by giving a little bit of an overview of my research results from my 4 articles, and then open up a discussion around the title of this presentation on EU water law in the books versus in action, and giving insights from a science policy perspective. So first of all, what is the Water Framework Directive all about? So it was adopted in 2000. And it's been considered as a very innovative and ambitious directive because it sets very high targets in terms of good ecological status for water bodies, with the goal to reach such status in all water bodies by 2015. And this was then postponed to 2027. But in practice, it turned out to be a very complex and technical directive to implement. And member states had quite a lot of flexibility in how they would interpret the EU law into their domestic system. So there's also a lot of variety in terms of implementation practices in member states. And overall, what we observe is quite a slow progress of water quality in Europe compared to what was expected. So of course, it has changed many things in terms of so local initiatives being emerging, water quality and water quantity rising also on political agendas, and some positive results are to be reported in terms of water quality instead of deteriorations in a lot of cases. But many challenges remain. In particular, there's less than half of European water bodies today that have achieved a good or high ecological status. And only one country is on track to meet the objectives of good ecological status by 2027, according to the WWF, and that is Finland. And I was actually talking this morning to a staff member of the Finnish Environmental Institute, and he was not as optimistic as the WWF for Finland either. So many challenges remain, and to illustrate a little bit the complexity of all the stakeholders involved and all the different languages that are used and the viewpoints around the WFD, I like to introduce this picture. So with policymakers, ecosystems, scientists, and lawyers, each expressing their own opinions. And a voice that I was particularly interested in hearing throughout the PhD was that of the scientists. So here you have this woman in the water saying, thousands of scientists have told you the law is great, just put it to work. And my question was, is this the only role that scientists have to, be in the water, testing, assessing the water quality, and then reporting back to policymakers, or are they actually involved as well in the policymaking phases behind the scenes? So I've been looking at three main phases of the policy process of the WFD. Its formulation, its evaluation, and its implementation. And at every step, I've been wondering to what extent does the science policy interface matter in the directions and the decisions that are taken by WFD actors, and what can we learn from science policy relations to maybe bridge or understand better the implementation gap. So to start with the formulation of the directive, which took place from 1994 to 2000, I conducted interviews mostly at the Commission with the DG Environment, but with people who were working there already in the 90s. I've interviewed as well experts from the Joint Research Center, which is the scientific arm of the Commission, and national expert delegates, which are sent by member states to participate to working groups at the Commission during policy drafting. And one finding is that such experts, including experts from the Commission, acted as policy entrepreneurs in policy design. So this means that they have seized a window of opportunity, which is that of a big EU reform in water management, and used it to exert agency on certain ideas that were promoted on the political agenda. So in the first chapters of my PhD, I've introduced the concept of transcoding. I won't elaborate on it too much because it's quite conceptual, but I'm happy to comment on that more in the Q&A. The concept of transcoding helps to represent the process of transforming knowledge into actionable knowledge. So it helps to describe the role of experts in participating to transform their scientific statements and ideas into operable policies. And by this, experts are quite crucial in facilitating the political compromise by making sure that the policy outcome will be viable technically and politically as well. So to give some examples, I've looked in particular at the role of experts in the policy design of the river basin scale approach and the cost recovery principle. And we see that their action or strategies around these two principles was quite different. So if we take the case of the river basin, it was already quite consensual around member states because it was already implemented in a few countries. And member states had actually quite a lot of leeway in adding lots of technical details in the annexes and indicating practicalities of requirements, and also being quite transparent on the consequences of implementing such principles for member states. So here their goal during this process of negotiation was to entrench the ambitiousness of the policy for later stages. So try to make sure that it wouldn't be undermined during the negotiations. And we have quite a really contrasting picture with cost recovery, which was much more controversial as a principle because it was also very new. And this principle requires for member states to recover the environmental and resource costs of water services. So these are all quite interesting terms, and actually to make sure that at least an economic principle would be adopted or integrated in the text of law. What experts, including also commission drafters, did was to wrap the terms around with a little bit of ambiguity. So for instance, the terms of environmental and resource costs were very vaguely defined. And the distinction between water services and water uses was only postponed to after the negotiations. So the idea here was really principally to try to have an economic principle on board, but not to scare away member states with very detailed requirements. So with this, we have the formulation of the WFD kind of gives an example of how a very ambitious policy can be accepted and adopted, but also how ambitious policy goals can be undermined by a low technical enforceability, because in both cases, the principles have been quite difficult to implement. The river basin scale approach was very complex, so it had a so-called intercalibration process had to be put in place later, which was extremely complex for member states to work around. And the cost recovery principle was kind of too vague and flexible for member states to follow. So some of them really bypassed, were able to bypass the requirement quite efficiently. So the next stage of my research was to look at two important moments for the WFD, the water blueprint in 2012 and the fitness check in 2019. And these are two moments of evaluation where the directive could have been revised or opened up, and where the progress of implementation by member states was assessed. So here I've interviewed again a different group of experts, again at the Commission, who were in charge of writing the evaluation report, but also hired expert consortia who were responsible for writing the support evaluation report. And here the transcoding strategies that I've identified are a little bit different. It's mostly conflict avoidance and arrangements around the legal flexibility of the WFD. So what does that mean? It means that experts have really put most of their efforts in trying to preserve the compromise reached in 2000. So by fear that member states will want to open up the directive to minimize requirements or to lower objectives, they really try to just make sure that the agreement would not be undermined and that things would kind of stay as they are. But the consequence of that is that radical proposals or new ideas are not really put on the table and things just remain as they are. So the status quo was not challenged. So then the last phase was to look at, okay, what are the actual implementation dilemmas in member states at domestic level? So I did a cross comparison between four member states, Sweden, the Netherlands, France, and Greece. And this time I looked at the organization of domestic science policy boundaries. So what I mean by that is that each country has its own way of structuring and organizing the relationship between policy and expertise. For instance, the relationship between the state and its agencies. So in certain countries, agencies have quite a lot of power in terms of decision making, and in others, it's really the ministries that have the decision making power. So I've compared this concept with another one, which comes from compliance theory, and that identifies three different possible senses of duty or attitudes of member states towards EU law. So these are transposition neglect, law observance, and domestic politics. And basically, Faulkner et al., the authors of that typology, mentioned that, for instance, Greece and France are typically falling under the transposition neglect category, meaning that EU law is really on the low end of their political agenda, and that they will comply only when sanctions or fines are sent out by the Commission. And this is very much the case when we look at the WFD implementation, because both countries have been quite late in delivering river basin management plans. They've been quite inefficient in distributing staff and resources to the implementation of the WFD. And they also have not really changed their current way of managing water that much. Sweden, on the other hand, is more a country of law observance, so basically complying and transposing the legal requirements pretty much accordingly to what was demanded by the EU. And the Netherlands, on the other hand, is a country of domestic politics, meaning that trade-offs are being made between domestic concerns and with EU legislation. And when there's a little bit of a debate, domestic concerns are prioritized over EU requirements. So that's one way to see or to understand implementation choices that have been made in each of these countries. But there's another factor that comes in that I wanted to look at, which is this concept of science policy boundaries. So for instance, if we take the case of Greece, it's a country that has a long tradition of governments working with expert bodies, but mostly with engineers and chemists. And it's also a country that has a quite centralized relationship between the state and expert bodies. So the state really prioritizes the interests of the government, and agencies don't really have a say in decision making. So this really comes in play when we look at the decisions that have the implementation choices that have been made right after the adoption of the WFD, because Greece started really installing a lot of monitoring sites and really prioritizing engineering solutions instead of, for instance, economic or ecological requirements of the directive. So here, this legacy and this tradition of the science policy boundaries also explains a little bit certain implementation choices. In Sweden and in the Netherlands, it's a bit different. There's a more horizontal relationship between the state and expert bodies, which leaves also a little bit more space and room for maneuver for expert bodies to challenge the decision makers indirectly and to make certain decisions themselves. So this also shows how science policy boundaries have a role in implementation practices. And this brings me to the discussion of this presentation, and also what I've been addressing in the conclusion of my thesis around the governability of the WFD. So there is a little bit of a divide, as we saw, between water law in the books and water law in action. So we see that the conclusion of the fitness check, which is the second evaluation of the WFD, considered that the directive was still fit for purpose, meaning that it was meant to still be relevant for improving water quality in Europe, and that certain countries, such as Sweden, are compliant with the law. But in practice, Sweden is an interesting case because we see that it did transpose legally most of the requirements of the EU, but it did so without really changing or challenging its current way of governing water. And as a result, the improvement in terms of water quality are not very significant. So it's still 14% only of surface water bodies overall that are in good ecological status in Sweden. So this gap also creates a little bit of a debate in academia, and some scholars explain it by saying that the WFD is ontologically unfit to improve water quality, meaning that the initial text of law is flawed in itself. Whereas other scholars argue on the contrary, that the WFD is theoretically does give the means to improve water quality, but it's the reductionist and minimalist implementation of member states that explains the lack of progress. So behind behind this debate, there's really the question of governability, and why is it that the WFD is not more governable? So there are, of course, many implementation dilemmas around coherence between agricultural and water policies, for instance. But what I was mostly interested in is the science policy interface. So one of the things that I argue in the conclusion is that the debate around the implementation deficits of the WFD collides with another one, which is the one of the crisis between science policy relations at domestic level. So the study of the role of experts really shows that the transition from expertise to policy worlds is challenging, and that it leaves space for power imbalances to develop and for political interests to meddle with the decision making. And one fundamental issue that we find is that the WFD has really incentivized and attempted for a shift towards systems thinking. So trying to consider water as a whole, manage it at the basin level, and also involving other sectors in this process. But the knowledge systems in place at domestic level are were not organized or ready to receive such systems thinking into implement it. So the results from the different papers and what we also just said, for instance, in the case of the evaluation phase of the directive, is that the idea of systemic change under the WFD is not really addressed, and radical or more imaginative discourses are not really put on the table, even though they would be necessary to fit with the spirit of the directive. So in the conclusion of the thesis, I also argue that there is possibility to bridge the implementation gap by reconfiguring science policy boundaries, and also in a way that is a bit more decentralized to leave more space for bottom-up transformations. So in particular, these science policy boundaries could challenge top-down valuation of knowledge in a way that considers knowledge not only as support to policy, but as part of the process. And in the literature, there are already quite a lot of recommendations in terms of finding stronger co-governance of central and decentralized authorities, incentivize cross-discipline cooperation, and having greater transfers of information, especially between the local level and the regional and national levels. So I won't bother you too much with this conceptual part of my thesis, but this is just a representation as well that can also represent the implementation gap by showing that at each of these transcoding cycles, the groups of experts involved specifically in these different cycles had to reach a compromise with the stakeholders involved, and at every step, the meanings and intentions of the WFD were narrowed down, which explains that at the implementation stage, there's also much lower ambitions and actual efforts that initially intended. And so, of course, there's so much research still being conducted around the WFD. It has really sparked a lot of interest from scholars. And a good thing is that by looking at it for the last years, I've also found more leads to research for the future. So one idea was that I found interesting the idea of looking also at transcoding failures in the sense of trying to analyze as well environmental policy proposals that are rejected and that don't make it to political agendas. Because I think it would be very interesting to analyze on what basis they are rejected, on what ideas crystallize the disagreements, and maybe from this take away some ideas for future policy making with the intentions to be a bit more bold and radical in future policy proposals. So one aspect that I really haven't covered in this PhD, but that came back in interviews a lot, is of course the massive role of agriculture and WFD in undermining WFD objectives. So this is very much another lead that needs to be followed, but that is also really triggering a lot of academic thoughts. I also haven't had the chance really to look at feminist theories around water governance, but I do believe that it would be really interesting to compare water ontologies from feminist scientists and experts compared to a more productivist view on water, and also to look if there is a transformative effect of having women participating to the decision making around the WFD. And of course, the post-2027 era is a big question mark for both scholars and decision makers. So everybody's a bit wondering what will happen after 2027. Will there be a second, a number 2 for the Water Framework Directive, or will the current one be revised, or will it be cancelled? So this is very much speculative research, but I think one question I really want to highlight would be to continue wondering how to go past the status quo and how to lead political reforms that are going beyond what is politically acceptable to the most economically powerful, and that are bold enough to, change the status quo. And I think, and I hope I have shown in this presentation, that there is potential for science policy relations to open that door and to change things a little bit on the ground. These are the partners of the NEWAVE network, and I will go to the last slide to thank you very much for your attention. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Nina, for this very interesting and insightful presentation. I think it's very interesting the way you are looking at the interface between science and policy. And I would like now to invite Peter Gameltoft to give his remarks on the topic. Thank you so much.
Yeah. Okay. Is the microphone on?
Yes, working very well.
You can hear me. Okay. Well, thank you. I think first of all to Nina for this presentation. I've been following this project over a couple of years. It's been a very interesting journey, and I can see we're now coming close to the end of this journey. And I think there are a number of very interesting results. Of course, I come to this as a practitioner. I've been working in water law in EU law for more than 20 years. I've been working in environmental law in Denmark, which is the country where I'm a citizen, and also working on environmental law there. So I come with, shall we say, a lot of baggage from environmental law, although my original background is I'm a chemical engineer. When I finished my education, there was no such thing as courses in environmental law or anything like that. So this was an area which I thought was interesting because, you know, you had to write part of the script yourself. The Water Framework Directive is a very complex directive, and I think we can see this in the whole of the implementation. And I think it's important to say that there's a role for the European Court of Justice to clarify. And it has clarified a number of things, but of course there are many more things. This is a huge directive. It touches on a huge number of issues, and there are lots of things that are yet to be clarified. So, you know, I think we will not see the end of this for quite some time about the meaning of this directive, and we have to improvise when implementing the directive. You mentioned, I think, that one country is on track for implementation of the Water Framework Directive. My experience with the Water Framework Directive is that I tend to think that there are no countries 100% on track. There are skeletons in the cupboard everywhere. And this is not just because member states are lazy and not willing to do things, but it's also a reflection of the real difficulties that there are in implementation of this directive. One thing is making requirements to wastewater treatment plants and things like that. That's a relatively standard thing. It's a question of money and not much else. When it comes to changing the behavior in sectors like agriculture, industry, and so on, it becomes much more complex because there are so many conflicting interests. And I think you mentioned, shall we say, the time perspective here. I think many of us thought that most of this directive would be implemented by 2015. And there would be a bit of some bits and pieces that would have to be addressed later on because they were particularly difficult. I think in retrospect, it's probably more the other way around, that most of it was postponed because of difficulties in the member states. And I think, the interesting discussion here is how can you improve this situation? How can you improve implementation? I will not go into a long argumentaire for why we need clean water. I think this is evident to everyone, and I think this is not what we should be using our time on today. The number of countries that are on track to full implementation of the Water Framework Directive, shall we say, has not been particularly encouraging. There have been, there are many delays. And why are there these delays? I think you raised the issue of the reviews in 2015 and 2021, and said, the Commission chose, shall we say, not to review the directive. And I would say that from my point of view, there are very good reasons for not doing so. Remember that it's the member states who not only have to comply with the directive, but they are also the decision makers in the Council of Ministers. And if you open a directive at a time where 2/3 or 3/4 of the member states have huge difficulties in implementing the directive, you can be sure they're going to try and water it down. And I think that, the decision not to reopen the directive in 2012 and 2018 must be seen in this light. You put some questions about the transcoding process and so on, and I think there's an issue here which I think you didn't touch on directly, which is one of cost effectiveness. There's a huge diversity of situations. The situation in Cyprus is very different from the situation in Ireland. Cyprus, it hardly rains. In Ireland, it rains almost all of the time. And there are very different situations and very different challenges that need to be tackled. And from the point of view of cost effectiveness, not to throw money down the drain, I think it was a wise choice to say that you need to adapt your measures to the challenges that you have. And this means that every member state must assess its own situation and see what it can do to improve the situation. So I think, this is an argument against uniform requirements, except for problems that everyone has, like urban wastewater and so on. Yeah, you mentioned the issue, or you refer to the issue of ambiguities also in implementation by the different member states. And what I read between the lines, if there were more uniform rules, you could avoid this. Yes, but the price of uniform rules is exactly that you impose the same measures everywhere and you lose on cost effectiveness, and you will basically be shot down with arguments about cost effectiveness. And therefore you need to find, in my view, one needs to find a balance here. The issue of governability of domestic situations, I think, is important here, because what I hear when you talk is that you say you want to decentralize more decisions to improve implementation. But this, I think, is, this is a two-edged sword, decentralization. And I would like to hear your comments on this. It's a question of power, basically. Agriculture, for example, is very powerful. It's very powerful across the EU, but it's powerful on different kinds of issues. The kind of issues they have in Spain or in Cyprus are not the same as they have in Sweden. But there is an issue here of power, and there is an issue of balance. At what level do you want decisions to be made so that they are not, shall we say, distorted by imbalances in power of the different actors? In a 100% agricultural country, I think it's very difficult, for example, for the water authorities to impose, shall we say, draconian measures on agriculture, even though it may be needed. You may need to go to another level. And the Water Framework Directive does not really provide a recipe for how to deal with this. But there is a real issue here, I think. We see it so much, I think, with agriculture. We've seen, what's happened very recently with all the tractors coming out as a way of putting pressure on the political system. And we can also see that the politicians are backtracking when it comes to environmental requirements. And the issue here, in my view, is that the farmers have an economic problem. And they've tried in the past to solve this in other ways, to get a different cut in the value chain for agriculture between wholesale dealers, agricultural producers, and the supermarket level. But the retail business, now this has obviously not worked, and now they are coming down like a ton of bricks on environmental requirements, and they are asking for simplification, which I doubt whether this will solve their problem. But that's another issue. That's what's on the agenda today, and you see that the politicians are reacting, or some of the politicians are reacting to this, and this is something, I think, where science could help us, and could help the environment, could help society in casting more light on these things, to say where, when are the solutions just, in my language, we would say just peeing in your pants to keep warm, or are they real solutions? You also go into the space for interpretation. This is linked, I think. There is a space for interpretation, and everywhere where there's a space for interpretation, there's also a space for the French word is détournement of the objectives. But on the other hand, you have the power relationships, and the power relationships are different at local, intermediate, and central level, local, national, and whatever, EU level. And again, I think there's an issue here of finding a balance between, getting decisions taken as close as possible to the actors, but without loss of effectiveness. And, this can vary, I think, from one sector to another. Personally, I tend to think that, when it comes to agriculture, you probably need to have a relatively centralized decision-making for many reasons. Also for reasons of competition, economic competition. Yeah.
Peter, can I ask something about that? So previously you mentioned that decentralizing decision was also a two-edged sword, bringing also issues of power interests. But so in what sense then is it more, maybe more, are you more in favor of decentralization in the case of agriculture? What advantage do you see in there?
Well, I see that in terms of agriculture, I think there's a lot of pressure from agriculture to have a harmonized approach. Every time you try and impose measures at national level, there is, the reaction is, but we will only do it if all the others have to do it. It's basically a market argument. That, if my butter becomes more expensive than the butter the other side of the border, I have a problem. And I will come out with my tractors and block your parliament and whatever. So it's to circumvent basically that kind of issue, to take out that argument, basically, because competition now, whether it's justified or not, I will not go into, but competition is always an argument when it comes to measures in agriculture. So that's certainly, at least that's my that's my experience. Well, in a certain sense, one has to sort of navigate here between Scylla and Charybdis. If you do one thing, you are killed. If you do the other thing, you are also killed. So you need to find the sort of narrow space in between, the channel where you can navigate and get your things done. From my perspective as, manager, administrator, or former manager and administrator of these things, my perspective is about getting things done and making things happen. And my experience is that you need to be, navigate very carefully when you do this, because if you go too much to one side, you're killed. If you go too much to the other side, you're also killed. So this is, I think, part of the issue here. Yeah, I think, I think what you're suggesting is that agriculture is a good litmus test for this, to show, whether the policy can succeed or not. I tend to agree with this view, but you need to be very careful in the way that you implement this, because we've seen recently, the tractors are coming out everywhere. And one, of course, needs to deal with this. It's not a question, I think, it's not a question that you can deal with only locally. Agriculture is probably the main problem for water policy. And it's not an issue that you should take lightly. It's not an issue that you can simply deal with by steamrolling the sector. You need to find ways of getting the sector on board. But I would say also that probably the Commission needs to take a broader view of agriculture. I mean, the privileged interlocutor in agriculture has been Copa Cogeca, which is a certain part of the agricultural sector. There are other organizations who, shall we say, play a lesser role. And I think that one of the things you could do is to make sure that you take in some of these other organizations and you also discuss with them. Copa Cogeca is like, well, from my point of view, you know, in some respects they live in the past, and I think one needs to move on, and the agricultural sector also needs to move on, because when you talk to agriculturalists, it's a different story very often that you get than when you talk to these organizations. So I think, personally, I think that, you know, from the authorities' side, there's a need to broaden the perspective about who you talk to. I think that's what I will say at this stage. I think it's very encouraging that that work is going on in this field. There's a big need for some reflection about you know, how to drive this agenda forward. I will not go into why. I think one needs to drive it forward, but it's clear that there are costs and negative impacts for large sections of society if you don't deal with the issues of water quality. We see it particularly in Southern Europe, but we also see it moving northwards with climate change. So, you know, the boundary between problem areas and non-problem, or shall we say less problem areas, is moving northwards. And I think this is something that one needs to deal with. It's an issue of, I think, governance, and I will just finish off. I'm also a member of something known as the OECD Water Governance Initiative. And I would say it's not only, it's also about a lot of the machinations that you put in place around water. It's about which administrative bodies have competences over what are the economic instruments that are in place, etc., etc., etc. What is the science that is being developed? Because some of this will have to be supported by new science, and so on. And I'll do a little bit of propaganda for the OECD's water governance principles. There's 12 principles involved, and you know, one of the insights behind this is that you need, so we say, simultaneous action on all the levers to make things work, because otherwise you get stuck. You know, there are plenty of examples, for example, where money has been put in place to support this, that, or the other, but the administrative competence, the distribution of administrative competence, there have been examples in Italy where such that things could not happen. Although the will was there, the money was there, but it was there in the wrong place, and so on. So, you know, a little bit of propaganda for these principles. I think it's worth having a look into them as well. Okay.
Thank you so much, Peter, for sharing your experience, also your initial journey. You started with that, and then also very important reflections. I will now pass the mic again to Nina. We have until 3 p.m. for some reactions from you. So please feel free to react to Peter. Thank you so much.
Thanks a lot, Katerina, and thanks, Peter, for all these super interesting insights. And I feel like there's so many angles we could start the conversation with. But I think one thing in particular that you were inviting me to reflect on is the question of governability and should decision making be more decentralized, especially when it comes to who decides, if it's more like expert agencies or ministries at the central level. And I think one big question that I've been trying to work my head around is that on the one hand, I really believe that looking especially, for instance, at Sweden and the Netherlands, that when expert bodies have more responsibilities and are also more decentralized, especially at the regional level, and also have interactions with municipalities at the local level, that there is really a trust relationship that is being built that allows also these bodies to challenge decision makers. So that's maybe one positive thing. But the other end of that is that, for instance, in the case of Sweden, there's actually a lot of different bodies having their own specific expertise, and it becomes a little bit messy as well in terms of who is responsible for what. So there's in particular these two agencies, SEPA and SWAM, and sometimes there's also conflicts happening in terms of who needs to do what, who is responsible for coastal waters, etc. And sometimes the fight of the idea is not to divide the expertise. On the contrary, I think having more conversations between the different experts is also part of this, reaching holistic systems thinking also in how the knowledge systems are organized at domestic level. I had this idea as well that I haven't mentioned the case of the common implementation strategy that I'm sure you know very well, but I was wondering, so this is just to explain a little bit, this is a system that has been put in place in 2001, so right after the directive was adopted, that allowed for working groups to discuss really the practicalities of how should the directive be implemented in each member state, and also trying to make sure that it would be adapted for each member state's domestic context. So there was a working group on the economic principles, trying to write guidance documents for member states to know how to implement cost recovery, etc. And I was wondering if maybe this system, which is very nice for information and knowledge sharing across countries, why doesn't it exist more as well at the domestic level? Having dedicated working groups for each country to have more knowledge sharing between the different types of experts, different kind of responsibilities, also to understand better the other parties, because as you mentioned, one big challenge with that is to reach a common language between the different actors in place. And as the little picture I was showing before reveals, at the moment, it's still very siloed. Everybody has their different views. And even though the objective is kind of similar for everyone, I think reaching improved water quality is really in the interest of everyone, including agriculture, especially with the rise of droughts and water scarcity in Europe as well. They still don't manage to really align and have a similar discourse in terms of how they want to do things. So that's why I thought this was valuable, but of course there are many challenges coming along with that, and I'm aware of it. Yes, I think that's mostly what I wanted to comment on. I don't know if you want to react to that, Peter, or if we should move to something else.
No, I can very quickly react to this. I mean, there is, of course, an issue. I think there's an issue between countries, and for this, there's a common implementation strategy where one discusses and adopts guidance documents. And these guidance documents are adopted by unanimity between the member states. Now, there's a sort of informal structure known as the common implementation strategy, where water directors meet every 6 months. Documents are adopted. There are various working groups and so on that prepare decisions by the water directors. But of course, the difficulties also surface here, For example, on the guidance about cost recovery, took a very long time to get implemented and did not go as far as the Commission would have liked at the time.
Yeah. It was even cancelled, no? Or
yes.
It was not really, yeah.
Yeah. So, you know, there are real issues here. I would also just like to say that, you know, there is an issue here. I mean, I think we talked about Sweden, and I think you mentioned a figure of 14% or something like that.
Yeah.
In Sweden, which complies with the requirements to water quality. And Sweden is very much a country that, so we say, it has a very formalistic approach to these things and has always been. I'm talking about this as a neighbor of Sweden. Sweden has had a sort of very legalistic approach and always wanting to be the good pupil in the class. And therefore they want to be very compliant. But I can tell you that Sweden has also been very pushy when it comes to requirements to water quality, of things that, you know, the Bothnian Bay is an area of a problem area for water quality. And in the water courses that lead to it, when I was in the Commission, you know, we said, but you need to apply the strictest requirements there because all the water flows into a problem area. And Sweden, shall we say, fought very bravely against this. And to some extent, they won this battle. They always want to be, shall we say, they like to be the good pupil in the class. It's very important, I think, for the Swedes. So, you know, yes, there are issues, and I think a bit the same goes for Finland. Finland is Finland is not, shall we say, I think Finland was the country that you mentioned, which was on track. I don't know the latest information. Maybe they are on track, but I suspect that there are issues in Finland that still need to be resolved. So things can be swept under the carpet in a structure like the Water Framework Directive. You can easily sweep problems under the carpet.
Yeah, because of the legal flexibility of it.
Yes.
Yeah.
Of course, it's up to the Commission to spot these things, throw light on these issues.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. It's a very interesting discussion, and I see how it's fitting already the comments and the questions that we are receiving in the chat, and I already see some movement with Dave replying actively to some of the questions. I will now invite Dave to give his remarks also on the conversation and the discussion that we had so far, and then of course we can move on to the questions from the audience. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Katarina, and thank you once again, Nina, for an excellent presentation as usual. It's been a pleasure to work with you on this project. As Katarina already mentioned, I've seen some of the questions that have come in. I've given a tentative answer, but maybe you're the expert now, so maybe you have the better answer than me. So please also check this. And I will do a little bit of a mixture of, let's say, some questions that I would have and some things that I've seen in the Q&A for you, so that you can, let's say, start interacting also with the audience of this meeting. I think one question that I found very interesting myself, and it's inspired by the Q&A discussion that's going on, is the Water Framework Directive a model for the rest of the world? Yes or no? So I remember the excitement when it was adopted. I was a time in the US at that time, and the American colleagues were like, this is brilliant. The fact that you have this in Europe and, you know, this is going to transform the practice of water governance. There was a lot of enthusiasm, and I think the EU has also trying to export this model of the Water Framework Directive to other countries. But is that still a good idea? What I would like to know what you think, Nina, about this, and some others also in the Q&A. Maybe a question that is more comparative about the principles that are in the Water Framework Directive, and the fact that maybe that transformative effect that we hoped it would have, it didn't have. And I think that if we look at your comparison, what you conclude is that, for instance, the cost recovery principle was really watered down quite significantly. And any economist will tell you, you know, that's where it starts. That's where the problem probably lies. So is cost recovery in the end maybe the most important principle? And should we have done more to preserve it, let's say, and prevent the watering down? How do you see that?
Okay,
Then you make a very clear distinction in your presentation also between, let's say, the development of the framework, the implementation and the evaluation. And I wondered if you could reflect a little bit more on this transcoding work that you talked about. And how maybe the transcoding work is different in each of these stages. So is it different to participate as an expert in developing a framework than it is then in evaluating it, for instance? And what is that difference then? And what does it mean for transcoding? In the Q&A, there was a question about the female scientist that you showed in the first image. You said, should she be in the water only, taking samples? Or should she do something else also? And maybe you can take that along when you answer this question. So, what is then the role of the female scientist? I think it was meant that way, that question.
Okay.
Then I think Peter also made a very strong argument that is maybe not only the science. So your argument is, science is key to explain, let's say, maybe the success of the framework. But I think that Peter also very clearly talked about interests and power that can back. Maybe also existing practices, because you're trying to roll out an approach to very different legal systems with very different ways of operating, and they all have to adapt to one approach more or less. And I think that some of the research has shown that these practices, as they die out very slowly. So in the Netherlands, for instance, we're always optimistic with our targets, and if we don't achieve them, we don't sleep less. We don't lose any sleep over it. We'll think we'll reach them 5 years later, maybe. So, but this was very serious, let's say. So it was hard, for instance, for my country, which is certainly not the best pupil in the class, as Sweden is, to adapt to this. But the key question is science indeed such a key aspect, or is it other things? And then maybe my last thing, because I don't want to be in the way of further interaction also with the public, maybe with the audience. The future of the Water Framework Directive, that's a very prominent question now, because we are approaching 2027. The political tide is turning. The tractors are rolling in all European capitals, more or less nowadays, also in Brussels. How can you sort of defend your idea that decentralization might be the solution? Because I would maybe take the position that actually centralization is the solution, because it's clear that policymakers in many countries cannot withstand this wave of tractors. Although I'm also not sure whether European policymakers are much better at it. But is decentralization really the key, let's say, to having a better future of the Water Framework Directive? And you made some statements here about the need to actually unlock or do away with the status quo. So to create a transformative effect for the Water Framework Directive. And is that only decentralization, or are there other things that we need to do?
Yeah.
Maybe also as scientists. So that was also a question in the Q&A, like, okay, what does this actually mean for the role of scientists? Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
I love all these questions. Okay, maybe I will start answering now, and then I'll go through the comments as well to see if I can jump in on other questions from the audience. Oh yeah, so first, is it still a good idea to explore the WFD? So it's very much, I think, a work in progress. So China is still looking into how to transpose the Water Framework Directive in its legislation, and the European Commission, correct me if I'm wrong, Peter, but it's been very active with the Eastern Partnership to also try to I would say diffuse or transfer the WFD model to Eastern European countries. And I've also touched upon that a little bit in the conclusion, wondering especially at the moment where there's actually also a water crisis going on, especially in terms of water quantity, which is also a bit of the, let's say, a weak point of the Water Framework Directive. Like water quantity is mentioned, but it's really not put on the on the front row. So is it the priority for these countries to improve water quality? And also, is the Water Framework Directive adapted to other hydrological contexts? It's been already so difficult to, as we talked about, like harmonization methods and trying to find a common language across European countries. So is this even feasible for countries that are much more arid or that have much more cases of droughts, etc., etc.? So. Of course, it's something that was planned to be researched, but there was no time for it. It was meant to be my fourth paper, and I wish I had time to study this question more in depth. But my hunch would be that maybe not. Maybe there are other priorities to tackle in these countries that are trying to incorporate the Water Framework Directive. And actually, I also don't really understand the motivation of the EU Commission in promoting the WFD elsewhere. I don't know what's the motivation behind it, and I don't know from which place it comes a little bit, but that's for other interviews, I guess. So the second question is about the cost recovery principle. And I remember from interviews that I wonder maybe if it was you, Peter, who said that it's the strongest and the weakest point of the EU Framework Directive, and that's already from how it's been formulated. So I think, and as I tackled a little bit in the presentation, experts kind of knew that it was a very important principles to incorporate, at least in the legal text, and to have an economic component. I think also member states, certain member states agreed with that. I remember a German water director who said that it was very much also a priority to have the economic principle included. But the cost and the price of that was that it is indeed very difficult to enforce due to its vagueness. So I'm sure more could have been done, but I don't know to what extent, seeing how it was formulated from the start, and that's maybe part of one of the biggest weakness of the other framework directives. How could have member states really taking on board this with this principle without it being really strongly defined, and without experts really being able, as we talked about in the common implementation strategy, to agree on this and to agree on the decision to take from there. I think one thing that could have been done is to follow up on more. We talked a little bit about the European Court of Justice. I think there's already been at least two major cases that also helped create a precedent to help define what is a water service, what should be included in that definition. And to also comply with the original idea of the Commission to have a broad interpretation of water services that includes navigation and hydropower and things like that. So I don't know to what extent having maybe more court cases could also help the implementation. I also read in the literature there are some authors arguing for having direct sanctions to agriculture, for instance, if agricultural farms or industries do not recover environmental and resource costs, that they would get direct sanctions from the EU. So that was one of the options that was proposed. Your next question, yes, I think the questions 3 and 4 are very much linked. So one was about the role of experts in every transcoding cycle, and is science the only answer? So I think to answer that, I don't want to be too long because there's so much to say, but so at every cycle, if we take formulation, implementation, and implementation, experts, I think, had to deal. I think so the question of science and power interest is extremely connected, and that's why I accentuated the presentation on science. But I think it already involves a lot the question of power dynamics and power interest, because experts are really the ones that are having to deal with that and find compromises between the different stakeholders. So the difference between the cycles and the main difference, I think, is that expert had to deal with very different political interests at stake. So at the formulation stage, it was more trying to anticipate what conflicts would arise between member states around certain ideas. I think at the evaluation stage, it was mostly navigating the industrial and agricultural lobbies, and also as we mentioned, the idea that member states were probably going to push for opening up the directive and lowering objectives. So here was also different political interest in terms of trying to preserve the directive as it was adopted with its original intentions. And implementation is also a very different kind of experts, because these are more practitioners and people acting on the ground at domestic level, or being part of state agencies or non-state bodies, expert bodies, and these have to deal with local actors and daily life of practitioners with their own economic interests at stake. So it's also a very different level of governance. So I don't know if that answers that part of the question, but I wanted to add so that we can move to the next part of the discussion after. That I haven't mentioned that part of the compliance theory that we talked about puts forward the idea of national arrogance, which is meant to be more specific to the case of transposition neglect countries. But the funny thing is that it was basically, I could have applied this term to all the 4 different states that I've looked at. Basically, everybody said, yeah, we thought we were so advanced and we didn't have to do anything, basically. So yeah, this idea that countries were also pretty sure they would do well even without changing their system is very prevalent in the countries that I've studied, and I'm guessing also in more broadly in others as well. I don't know if I have time to tackle the question of the future of the WFD, because that's a big topic. But that's very interesting, how to defend decentralization when tractors are working in the capitals or rolling in the capitals. What I think is, yeah, I had an interesting conversation as well in terms of, I don't necessarily mean decentralizations of only state bodies having decentralized sub bodies at the different levels of governance, but really more decentralizing really just science policy relations, so that there's better transfer of knowledge in the different levels of governance, and having also bodies at municipal level, for instance, that have some kind of transcoding power as well to interpret their own decision and adapt it to the local context. So in that sense, I think it doesn't really conflict necessarily with all the problems that are happening with agriculture and farmers being on the street. It's just a matter of also adapting better the knowledge system at the local level as well. I don't know if that answers all the questions. how should we proceed, Katerina? Should I let Dave answer back, or should I go through the questions in the chat?
Thanks so much, Nina. I think, yeah, Dave made a good summary of many of the questions actually that are posted in the chat. There's one in particular that maybe I would like to follow up with and ask to you, and is the question from Teresa, actually, that she asked about the role of scientists. And she didn't mean specifically to the female scientists, but the role of scientists in general. So I can read their question. I think like you addressed it, but maybe we can read it again together to go a bit more into detail. So you mentioned that the ambitions are watered down from the EU to the implementation at more local level. And today, thinking about your research and wondering about the role of the woman taking samples in the river, so in the initial picture, what roles or hats to wear do you see for scientists, apart from reporting back, in order to strengthen implementation and compliance? And can you say anything about what is necessary to support the roles? I think we also covered a bit in the NEWAVE, like we actually covered extensively what is the role of scientists and researchers in water governance research. So perhaps, yeah, we can expand a bit more on that. Thanks.
Yeah, thank you so much for that question, Teresa. I think one thing that comes to my mind is that there's also one of the recommendations or ideas that I thought about in the conclusion is also that the WFD has brought so much complexity in water-human relations that there's also, I think, a need to simplify these relations and come back to something a bit more grounded. And so having, for instance, this woman taking samples in the river who is probably the one that knows best how the ecosystem functions, just at the water level in the region where she's working, is probably also the best person to talk to when decisions are made at policy level. So there are systems for public participation that are in place through the directive. It's one of its core principles. And I haven't studied it that much, so I don't know to what extent it is functioning in the different member states, and to what extent local scientists like the woman in the water are able to join these discussions. But I think to a certain extent they are. I just don't know if decisions are really taken on board in practice. But what I've also presented throughout the presentation is that indeed there is a disconnection between the scientists that work really in the field and scientists that work more in expert agencies. And they also, I guess, have a different view and a different approach to water management, because some are just also having a bit more conceptual, theoretical representation of what is going on and of the policy process, while others are really focusing on monitoring pollutants and monitoring ecosystems in the water. So maybe there are also possibilities here to have a bit more knowledge transfers between these two scientific worlds themselves, not necessarily to the policy level, but really just between these two subgroups of scientists working with WFD.
Thank you so much, Nina. And I think following on different roles, there's also another question from Prakriti. And so the question is, during your fieldwork, did you encounter certain institutional aspects of governance, in particular in Water Europe, and then is also adding at the European Commission, that might be systematically contributing to transcoding failure?
Yeah, that is very interesting. By Water Europe, do you mean a specific institution, or because I don't think I know that term, or is it just Water in Europe?
I think it was Water Europe as an institution because it's capitalized.
Okay.
So if you have done fieldwork, let me see if in the chat.
So I haven't looked at all in Water Europe, but I will look it up. But at the EU Commission level, and I've had actually discussions with Peter about that during my interviews, is that there are strong tensions between DG Agriculture and DG Environment. And so a case that is maybe systematically contributing to transcoding failure, as you put it very well, is maybe that, for instance, what I showed in the evaluation reports of the blueprint and the fitness check is that the DG Environment anticipates a lot that DG Agriculture is going to shut down proposals that refer to land use in general, or that are susceptible to affect land use practices. So in that sense, it's also limits the capacity of the DG Environment to challenge the status quo, because they cannot make proposals that are really challenging the agricultural sector. So I hope that answers the question. And maybe Peter, if you want to react on that, I'm sure you will have things to say.
Okay. Well, what I can say is that, you know, it's important to be aware of provisions in the EU treaties about this, and this applies to land use. It also applies to water quantity. These are not co-decision between the European Parliament and the Council with qualified majority voting in the Council. It's unanimity in the Council.
Mm-hmm.
You know, you don't have to be Einstein to see that it's much more difficult to deal with when all member states need to vote in favor of something in order to get things adopted. And this is the problem, I think, with water quantity. It's also the question of land use, for example. Now, there are provisions in the treaty that allow the Council to move these things to co-decision with the Parliament and qualified majority voting, like for everything else. And I think, I mean, you know, you raised, I think the question about water quantity.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, Dave raised the question about water quantity and, you know, the issues of water scarcity in the south of Europe. And we all know that the border between water scarce areas and less water scarce areas is moving northwards because of climate change.
Yeah.
And I think that, you know, for the Water Framework Directive model, for the integrated water management to be successful, one needs to move things like water quantity and so on to qualified majority voting. But the Council has to decide this by unanimity. You know, there's a certain, I mean, the Council has a role here. The Council is both, shall we say, the accused and the judge in these matters, and this makes things difficult. And it's only when things become very, very difficult, I think, that the Council will move to change these things. But from my personal point of view, it would be important for this to happen, given what we are seeing in the area of water and continued success of this. This is one thing I would say. There's one thing that hasn't come into the discussion. I mean, you referred to Sweden as being, I think, one of the good students in the class.
Yeah.
But you also referred, I think, to the fact that only 14% or something like that of
yeah, I think it's 60% of natural surface water bodies are already in good ecological status, but only 2% of the heavily modified ones. Yes. So overall, that's a total of 40%, I think.
Yeah, and you know, the European Court, one of the things the European Court of Justice has done, you know, it's said in different rulings that it's not enough to go through the motions of implementing the directive. There's an obligation of result,
yeah,
which I think is a very important ruling.
Yeah.
But then coming back to the question that was raised by Dave, I mean, you know, the issue of water quantity is becoming increasingly important. And, you know, this is one of the reasons why I personally think that, you know, for this to be successful in the longer run, one needs to water quantity issues also to qualified majority voting co-decision with the parliament, because you cannot separate the two. You know, what is today a water quality issue will become a water quantity issue, and vice versa. And you need a uniform set of rules to deal with these things. Otherwise, I think it will not be successful.
Thank you.
Yes, we have time for a short reaction from your side, Nina, and then we move forward to the closing.
All right. Yeah, I don't know what to add to that. Actually, I think I really agree. I was surprised even to not really come across more water quantity issues in my fieldwork, especially. Well, it was definitely an issue in my fieldwork during my fieldwork in Greece, being also really suffering from water scarcity and having also to deal with water transfers to the islands. But I was surprised, for instance, in France, that it didn't come up more, because it's definitely something that is also rising on political agendas. But I think in the end, it's not really something that comes to mind in the first place when we talk about the Water Framework Directive. I think really the obligations of results for good ecological status are really the main thing that comes to mind. So in interviews, it was really, we didn't discuss so much the water quantity aspect. So I would be curious to research more about that in the future. I think it's going to become a much more prevalent issue for European water bodies in general.
Thank you so much. And this leads to a perfect closing for
Can I just put in one remark?
Yes.
And
yes.
It's a very, very short remark. And
yes.
It's, you know, what is required by EU legislation is very often what sets the agenda, the work agenda of water agencies in the EU member states. So, you know, as there are hardly any quantitative obligations, resources have put over where there are EU obligations to avoid infringement cases and so on. So, you know, there's a very clear mechanic at work here. That's all.
Thank you so much, Peter. And yeah, I want to thank all the speakers to today's seminars, Nina, Peter, Dave, and also Jean-Paul. And just moving forward to close the session, this is a reminder that after today's seminar, in 2 weeks at the same time, we will have a second seminar from Radhika Singh on scaling rainwater harvesting systems, specifically focusing on a country, with a country focus in Kenya, And then, of course, you can consult the entire schedule of the seminars in our website. As you see, they will last until December of this year. And yes, and this is also a reminder to another webinar that the NEWAVE will host today, together with the Amsterdam Sustainability Institute, in about half an hour. And that will be hosted on Teams, and you can find all details for registering in our website. And again, a special thanks to all our host institutions and partner organizations, and to all of you to attending the seminar today.